All right, jaysanalysis.com. This time we're going to return to Plato, and I apologize for taking so long on this. I had a busy past few weeks running about. I ended up in Las Vegas this last weekend to help Patrick Henningsen with a documentary he's working on, The Last Rancher, and that's going to be about the Bundy situation. So now we're going to get back to Laches, which is the next Socratic dialogue in the version of Plato's works that I have. And this dialogue is interesting. It moves on to a discussion of the virtues. Let's see, the last one that we discussed was Charmides, which was about beauty, aesthetics, the good, sophrosune. And now we're going to talk about the next virtue in his lineup, which is courage. And so the question here was detrimental to the Greeks. Aristotle has works where he raises this question, deals with it, discusses it. It comes up in his Politics, comes up in other discussions on the virtues in Aristotle's works. So let's see, let's get into this. Particularly with the military culture of ancient Greece, you know, if we think about films like 300, we can get a Hollywoodized version of the idea of nobility and warfare, courage, so forth. But when we actually look at Plato's works, we see that bravery and courage are a little bit more complicated than we might think. Bravery and courage are not what the masses think bravery and courage are. And so there's a discussion between a couple military generals, military soldiers, so forth, and Socrates. And Socrates engages in a series of interrogations, a series of what's called the elenctic method. Some commentators think that the purpose of this dialogue is merely to give an example of the Socratic elenctic method, and that's really just question and answer. So when the opponent in the course of the dialogue gives his position, elenctic is the methodology of questioning. So the Socratic method, the elenctic method, is question, answer, trying to get at the root of the issue. So for the Greeks, the art of war was important, and youths were taught the art of war. It was very important for young men, especially, to go through the process of entrance into adulthood, that sort of rite of passage to become an adult member of the community, a masculine member of the community. And Socrates begins his interrogation, his dialogue, by submitting to the elders, those above him, and does not pretend to have knowledge of more than is appropriate for him in his state in life. So we see this continually with Socrates, where he sort of plays the fool, even though in truth he may be less foolish than his interlocutors and those that are around him. So he's goes into a discussion of he starts asking these guys what bravery is, what courage is, and they give answers about they put forth sort of their first thoughts, which are not very good answers. And so Socrates says, well, surely you think that one who's engaged in praxis is better than one who's merely engaged in theoria, right, or theory. So actual action in this field is more important than just theoretically understanding it. So there's, of course, the confrontation with sophists. The sophists often come up because the generals that are being asked questions here and giving their opinion about virtue and courage talk about run-ins with the sophists. And the sophists, if we recall, were the guys who kind of went around and in a somewhat of a similar way to Socrates, asked questions for the sake of questioning. The goal of the sophists was to present relativism. So the sophists were sort of the skeptics of the day, the we can't know anything, nothing's true crowd that dominates the narrative, the discussions of philosophy in our day. We're ruled by the age, the era of the sophists today. And Socrates and Plato are not sophists. They are not to be classed in that method because that approach, because they often debate with the sophists. So for Plato, for Socrates, there's always an agenda of combating the sophists and sophistry. But the generals, the military men, give their first advice, or their answers as to what courage is. And Socrates says, well, your answers don't really work. So we can't say that courage is just sort of charging forth into battle, okay? Because a person could charge forth into battle in a stupid way. They could be foolish. They also might charge forth out of fear, which then wouldn't be courage. It would be something else. So it would be being rash. So being rash isn't courageous. Running away obviously isn't courageous. And so the idea comes about, well, maybe we need to ask what the nature of virtue itself is. So different questions are posed as to wisdom. One of the guys says, well, maybe courage is wisdom. Socrates says, well, it might relate to wisdom, but it can't just be wisdom, because a person might be wise without the instances of displaying courage. So they can't be exactly the same. And then the idea is posed, well, maybe it involves reason, maybe it involves adherence to morals. Then Socrates says, well, it can't just be identified with those things, because all those things have aspects about them that are specific to those virtues. And so to just simply identify it as another virtue doesn't work, because they're all sort of specific for different cases and different instances. So courage is a part of virtue, but it can't be exactly linked to some other virtue or identified with it. So fear, Socrates notes, is something that's future oriented. So we might have a fear about the past, or excuse me, about the future. So fear is always future oriented, and courage might or might not relate to the future, because you might have been courageous in the past. You might display courage in the future. So there's sort of a hint that when Lysis says, well, maybe courage is the knowledge of the fearful and the hopeful. And Socrates says, well, that might work, but those are still only parts of virtue. And so if that's the case, then again, courage is only one part of the virtues. And then there would be then a contradiction in saying both that it is its own thing and yet at the same time identified with other virtues. So the question of the form of virtue, or the form of courage, is ultimately where Socrates is going. But interestingly, in this dialogue, he does not present a definitive, complete answer at the end as to what it is. So there's going to be a lot more discussion of this matter in other dialogues. The next dialogue will be the Lysis, and Lysis will deal with friendship. So we'll talk about that next. But suffice to say, for Laches, it's really, again, to present the methodology of investigation, the methodology of questioning, the methodology of critical commentary. So learning the Elenctic method, I think, is sort of what Socrates' main point in this dialogue is. And so hearkening back to the Apology, where Socrates went around to the different artisans and the different people who had different trades and different crafts, politicians, poets, whatever, and asked them their different views as to what the good life is and so forth. And they all gave different answers, of course, that were sort of modeled after their trade. In the same way, talking to these military dudes, for them, there's a certain difficulty, a reticence, a hesitation, there's a foggy, unclear nature to the question of what courage is for the guys who, in Socrates' mind, ought to be the go-to guys for what courage is, and yet once again we see, like the Apology, the specialists in the field themselves often are not clear as to what they're working with, right? So we saw that with the Apology, and we're seeing it again here with Laches and the soldiers, the generals that he's talking to. And they don't seem to be able to give a good, clear answer as to what courage is. Right? So it can't be. It has to involve reason, and it has to involve morals. We know that much of it. But it can't just be simply identified with some sort of pleasure, some sort of rash satisfaction gained from charging into enemy territory. It can't be identified with not being afraid, because there might be a situation where fear is useful in a positive way, right? So not a timid view of fear, but rather more of a cautionary view, right? So caution could be good, and the opposite of courage would be cowardice, right? Cowardice would always be wrong. So any of the answers that the guys give, that can demonstrate in some way. What Socrates does is try to demonstrate in some way that none of those answers are sufficient, and that's essentially what he does. So it can't be anything merely future related in regards to fear. And so there's no clear answer in this dialogue. And this is interesting because in some of the dialogues we've seen clear answers, right? So Socrates chooses to give an answer in some cases, in other cases he doesn't. In this one he chooses not to. And it ends with the recruitment of Socrates to teach young men the question of courage and virtue. And there's a citation from Homer that Socrates gives. Modesty is not good for a needy man. And by that he means that all of you guys that I've just questioned, you don't have a clear idea of what courage is. And so clearly you're in a state of need, whereas originally in the dialogue I came to you in a state of need because I thought you would have the answers, and you don't. And so in actual fact, it would be better for you to come to me. Right? So there's a sort of a humble brag on the part of Socrates here, saying I'm the go-to dude, but without saying it. The subtlety of the Socratic method is evidenced here. So that is the essence of Laches, and we're going to go to Lysis next and take a look at that and the question of friendship. Next up, we're gonna have Lysis, and Lysis is the dialogue concerned with the definition of friendship. So the first talk that I did before this was Laches, and that was free for listeners. But at this point, for the next two dialogues that are going to be included in this talk, both Lysis and Euthyphro, that's going to be for paid subscribers. So I want to extend the invitation to those who've listened to this. I have an archive of previous discussions that go in depth into Platonic dialogues. We're working our way through the whole corpus, and we're about 7 or 8, 9 dialogues in. So if you're hearing this and you like what you've heard so far, and you like some of the other free samples, go ahead and subscribe to jaysanalysis.com. I have several buttons on my site where you can subscribe for $4.95 a month, and you get a weekly in-depth philosophical discussion or interview that will deal with either philosophy, film, geopolitics, or theology. So there's a consistent production that'll be sent to you, secret link via email, and you're getting a college education for free, almost. I mean, if we were to compare the costs of $2,000 per semester for philosophy classes with getting it from somebody who would like to expose the state school system and go against that kind of rip-off, that's really what it is, then go ahead and subscribe to Jay's Analysis. Like I said, fraction of the cost, and you're going to get something far more in depth than what you would get in the standard school setting. So you can't beat that, and that's my way of sort of going independent and stepping outside of that establishment sort of cultural Marxist communist state-controlled system that's intended on brainwashing and breaking down the public, the populace, and ending classical education. So we want to preserve that. And one way to preserve that is not just through recording audios, but in terms of putting it into people's heads. So in the same way that Homer, the Homeric tradition, was sort of an oral thing passed on, we're doing something similar here at Jay's Analysis. We're putting an oral tradition down and passing that on into your mind so that you can then pass it on. So subscribe to jaysanalysis.com, and there's a whole archive of interviews, about 40 or 50 interviews now that you can listen to. Several of those are from months back or years back are now free. So you can check those out. Really, really deep, in-depth stuff, history, geopolitics, film, theology. But for now, we're going to go ahead and continue with Lysis, the next dialogue in the Platonic corpus.